My name is Grace, and what I'm about to share is a story I probably should have kept buried. I'm a 45-year-old woman, navigating the bleakest chapter of my life. Years of a crumbling marriage eventually led to a bitter divorce, leaving me adrift in months of self-doubt and isolation. I stopped recognizing the woman staring back at me in the mirror. Every time I stood there in nothing but my underwear, I'd hear this voice in my head asking, "Why would anyone ever find you desirable anymore?" The compliments that once reassured me of my beauty had dried up long ago, replaced with a deafening silence. I lost touch with who I was. Maybe if I'm honest, I let myself slip away. I stopped going out entirely, retreating into a life that wealth couldn't make any less lonely. Riches don't fill the void. They just give you a bigger, quieter room to sit in. Before I dive further into this story, I want to invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Each click and comment gives us the encouragement to keep sharing these raw, meaningful stories. If you enjoy this content, share it with others, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Every interaction helps build a stronger, closer community. Thank you for being here, and I hope you'll stay until the end. And now, let me tell you about Tyler. I fought against him at first, really I did. But no matter how hard I tried to resist, something about him, despite the 25-year age gap, broke through the walls I had so carefully built. He had this warmth about him, this pull that I couldn't ignore, and before I knew it, I found myself wrapped in his arms, unable to deny what was happening. When my new neighbor moved in, I had no idea this carefree young man would flip my world upside down. The first time I saw him, he was walking along the sidewalk, wearing a pair of ripped jeans and a plain white t-shirt, his grin brighter than the sun. He couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, full of life, completely unbothered by the weight of the world. I remember watching him from behind the curtain, clueless about the storm that was heading my way. Tyler wasn't shy, not in the slightest. His introduction was bold, almost too bold, and unlike anything I'd expected. One morning I opened my front door, and there he was on my porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee like he owned the place. "Grace," he said with this infuriating confidence, "this neighborhood is way too boring. So, I've decided it's my job to save you from it." His tone left me momentarily stunned. "I don't think we've met," I replied, trying to keep my cool. But he just shrugged, that cocky smirk never leaving his face. "Well, everything has to start somewhere," he shot back. "And we can start with you inviting me in for coffee. After that, maybe we'll talk about your bedroom." The audacity of it. I felt a mix of irritation and, embarrassingly, intrigue. "Thanks, but no thanks," I said, moving to close the door. But before I could, he leaned in slightly and said, "Grace, when's the last time you had an adventure?" His eyes locked on mine as he took a slow sip of his coffee, and then he added, "If you can't remember, that's your problem right there." I tried to brush him off, but Tyler wasn't one to take no for an answer. Over time he found new ways to push my buttons and sneak under my skin. One afternoon, as I was tending to my overgrown garden, he appeared out of nowhere. "Grace," he asked with an unusually serious tone, "when you look at these flowers, what do you see? Just wilted leaves? Or the beauty that's waiting to bloom again?" His words dug into me, stirring something I hadn't felt in years. "Tyler," I said with a wry smile, "guys your age don't normally talk like this." But he didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his piercing eyes holding mine. "Guys my age usually waste their time talking nonsense," he said. "But me? I'd rather spend it with someone who's worth it." Day by day, his presence became harder to ignore. Our conversations, though flirtatious, always seemed to carry a deeper purpose, like he was on a mission to shatter the safe little bubble I had built around myself. One evening, as we sat on my porch, the soft rustle of leaves filling the quiet air, Tyler turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Grace," he asked, his voice almost a whisper, "why do you always seem so in control? Don't you ever just let go? Have you ever stripped away all the layers and done something wild? Like swim in the ocean at midnight or give yourself to the one person your heart truly wants?" His words hit me like a truck, but I couldn't let him see it. I met his gaze steadily, trying to make sense of this reckless young man. "Tyler," I said, my voice firm but calm, "you're still too young to understand. Losing control. It's not always as thrilling as it sounds." I met his gaze with defiance, daring him silently to push further. But Tyler, being Tyler, didn't back down. Instead, he gave me that infuriatingly cocky smile, the one that always managed to rattle me. "No, Grace," he said, leaning in just enough to blur the line between bold and invasive. "The real problem is you've never truly discovered who you are. Maybe that's what you need me for. Let me help you figure it out." His audacity sent a surge of conflicting emotions through me. Part anger, part fascination. His words were so daring, so disarming, that they left me both flustered and strangely intrigued. The very next day, there he was again, standing on my porch with some flimsy excuse about needing advice on fixing up his new house. But I wasn't fooled. I knew what he was really doing. Sure enough, the conversation took a familiar turn. "Grace," he began, leaning slightly across the table, his eyes piercing into mine with unsettling clarity. "I can see it in your eyes. There's still that spark, that fiery passion of your younger years. But you've buried it so deep, you can't even remember where you hid the key." His words hit me like a slap, stirring a mix of embarrassment and irritation that I couldn't fully suppress. Clinging to my pride, I shot back. "Tyler, does this persistent act of yours actually work on anyone?" His smile widened, full of self-assured mischief, as if he'd been waiting for me to ask. "It's not persistence, Grace," he said, his voice dipping into a softer, more serious tone. "It's honesty. I'm just trying to show you what you've forgotten. That fire inside you. The one you've convinced yourself doesn't exist anymore." As much as I hated to admit it, his words wormed their way past my defenses. Tyler had this unnerving ability to see through me in ways no one else ever had. A few days later, I was sitting on my porch sipping tea and pretending to be calm, though my nerves were anything but. He appeared again, walking up with that same unshakable confidence, stopping just at the edge of my space. His eyes locked onto mine, intense and searching. "Grace," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "if you trust me, even just once, and let go of all the walls you've built, I promise you'll feel things you've never even dared to dream about." His words weren't just a suggestion, they were a dare, and I felt the challenge in the air like a storm about to break. For a moment I hesitated, my heart pounding against the uncertainty of it all. But in his eyes I saw something raw, something genuine, and it pulled me in like nothing ever had. The risks of letting him get too close were obvious, but the allure of those risks was stronger. "All right, Tyler," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "What do you have in mind?" He stepped closer, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered, "Just let go, Grace. Go with the flow. Control is your greatest enemy." His words lingered in my mind, echoing louder than I wanted to admit. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. That night, for the first time in years, I let go. I surrendered the tight grip I'd always held on my life, my thoughts, my every action. Tyler and I walked through the pouring rain for hours, each step feeling like a release from the weight I'd been carrying for so long. My white shirt clung to me, soaked through, turning translucent and revealing more than I ever intended. But I didn't care. Not in that moment. I saw the fire in Tyler's eyes, a wild intensity that consumed everything in its path. "Grace," he said suddenly, his voice dropping to a low, almost feral growl, "a woman like you isn't meant for an ordinary life. You've got volcanoes in your heart, and I want to see them erupt." His words broke through the walls I'd spent years carefully building. All the caution, the restraint, the layers of self-protection. I felt them crumble in his presence. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't guarded. And it was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly unavoidable. Our connection felt immediate, as if the rain had washed away every remaining barrier between us. I stood there shivering, the cold biting at my skin, but when Logan's hands found me, the warmth he carried was unlike anything I had ever known. His touch wasn't just comforting. It was electric, stirring sensations in me that I thought had long faded. The way his fingertips moved, deliberate and unhurried, sent ripples of heat coursing through me, waking parts of me I'd buried so deeply I'd nearly forgotten they existed. When our eyes met, I saw something in his gaze that held me captive. There was a daring intensity mixed with an undeniable desire, as if he was silently challenging me to stop holding back and simply let go. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, each second charged with something unspoken yet undeniable. Logan's hands glided from my shoulders to my waist, His movement so natural it was as if we'd known each other in a lifetime long before this one. My breath hitched as the space between us melted away, leaving nothing but an electric pull. "Grace," he murmured, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "Stop doing this to yourself. Stop fighting so hard and just feel." His words weren't just a suggestion. They were an invitation, almost a command, to let go of the control I clung to so desperately. Part of me resisted, instinctively pulling back toward the safety of my carefully constructed walls. But there was another part. A buried, restless part, that yearned to leap into the unknown, to trust this reckless yet magnetic force standing before me. And for the first time in years I listened to that part of myself. I stopped holding back. In an instant the distance between us vanished. Suddenly nothing else mattered but the energy crackling between us. Raw and overwhelming. Together we stripped away every layer of armor we had built around our hearts, standing exposed, vulnerable, and undeniably real before each other. When his lips finally met mine, it was as though every chaotic thought in my mind dissolved into quiet. The storm inside me stilled, replaced by a wild, exhilarating rush that I hadn't felt in years. His touch was assertive, almost possessive, but there was a tenderness beneath it that made me ache in ways I couldn't explain. I didn't want it to stop. As our kiss deepened, a release surged through me, igniting parts of me I didn't even realize I'd lost. It felt like a dam breaking, a flood of raw, unfiltered emotion and sensation sweeping through me. Slowly but with unrelenting power, the volcano inside me came alive, erupting with a force I could hardly contain. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something primal. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just existing. I was alive. When Logan pulled back slightly, as if to give me a moment to catch my breath, I refused to let him go. I clung to him, wrapping myself in his embrace like a lifeline, ignoring the sharp thorns of the rosebush pressing into my back. The discomfort didn't matter. All I cared about was holding on to this fleeting, all-consuming moment. What I felt that night wasn't just physical. It was a kind of liberation I hadn't known I needed. Logan wasn't just offering me companionship or even passion. He was giving me something far more profound. He was offering me a way back to myself. A chance to shed the weight of years spent doubting, fearing, and hiding who I was. Every touch, every whispered word, broke down the walls I'd spent so long building and rewrote the way I saw myself. That night with Logan wasn't an end but the beginning of something much larger than either of us could fully comprehend. After that, what we had became something more than an affair, yet far from ordinary. It was like a marriage, but one defined by intensity and raw honesty rather than routine. With Logan I didn't just live. I rediscovered myself. And I knew this was only the start of a journey that would change me in ways I could never have imagined. With Logan I felt like time had rewound itself. As if I were 20 again, vibrant, alive, and full of untapped potential. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. Whether we were out in public, cooking together in the kitchen, lounging on the couch, or tangled up in bed, he treated me with a level of care and attention that melted my defenses. His every touch and word seemed to chip away at walls I hadn't even realized I'd built around myself. Every moment with him stretched my boundaries, taking me to places I never imagined existed. I truly believe this was just the beginning of an endless, exhilarating adventure. I pictured us carving out a lifetime of wild, unforgettable days that we'd both carry with us forever. But, as with all things too intense to sustain, cracks began to show. Our undeniable connection became the talk of the neighborhood, whispers spreading like wildfire. I couldn't help but feel a nagging discomfort creeping in, but Logan remained unbothered. His confidence only magnified what unsettled me the most. The looming shadow of my ex-husband. That man had shattered my life in ways I was still piecing together, and though I didn't want to admit it, a part of me feared he'd hear about Logan. It wasn't love or lingering affection for my ex, it was the idea of him seeing me like this, vulnerable and exposed, that unnerved me. Logan sensed it too, though he never said so outright. But something in him shifted. He didn't grow cold exactly, but the way he looked at me changed. I no longer felt like the woman he'd been so captivated by. Instead, I began to feel like just another body, someone he craved in the moment but didn't cherish. His once tender touch gave way to something rougher, more urgent, and far less intimate. The romance and care that had once defined our nights disappeared. replaced with something almost mechanical. The pleasure was still there, but it came with an undercurrent of fear I couldn't ignore. Every morning, I woke to find bruises in the shape of his fingers marking my skin, their presence both a memory of the night before and a warning of what I was enduring. My body ached with a kind of exhaustion I hadn't known before, making simple tasks like walking a challenge. One evening, I came home earlier than usual, stepping into a nightmare I hadn't anticipated. A young woman was standing in my house wearing my clothes. Worse, she wasn't alone, Logan was with her. Rage surged through me, white-hot and uncontrollable, as I stormed inside, confronting them. What followed was an explosion of anger, accusations flying back and forth between Logan and me. The fight was ugly, raw, and louder than anything we'd ever experienced. And then Logan, his voice breaking with frustration, yelled something that stopped me cold. "Do you even care about me? You're still hung up on your ex-husband. You miss him, don't you? That's why I do this, to take my revenge." His words struck me like a thunderclap. I had never fully acknowledged how much my past was still haunting me, but hearing Logan throw it in my face made it impossible to ignore. In that moment, I realized how deeply my unresolved emotions had bled into this relationship, tainting everything we'd built. That night, our argument reached its breaking point, but in a strange way, it also became a turning point. The emotional dam that had been holding back so much finally burst, forcing us to confront everything we'd both been avoiding. The tension between us reignited, sharp and all-consuming, as if the volcano that had erupted on our first night together was awakening once more. From that moment forward, our dynamic shifted. There was a raw transparency between us that hadn't existed before. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was honest in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. And as much as I hated admitting it, I realized something about myself. I craved what Logan gave me. The intensity, the fire, the chaos, it was all consuming, and I welcomed it in spite of everything. To those of you who've stayed with me through this story, thank you. If you haven't yet, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Even a small gesture like pressing that button means the world to us. Your likes, shares, and comments give us the encouragement we need to continue creating content that connects us. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.